Hello and welcome to the Health Bridge podcast. This is your host, Holly B, and I have an incredible conversation for you guys. You're in for a treat today. I am talking with Dr. Stephen Hussey. Dr. Hussey is both a chiropractor and a functional medicine practitioner. He attained both his degrees, or both his doctorates of chiropractic and a master's in human nutrition and functional medicine from the University of Western States in Portland, Oregon. He is a health coach, a speaker, and the author of two books on health. The first one is The Health Evolution: Why Understanding Evolution is the Key to Vibrant Health. And his second book, most recent book, is Understanding the Heart: Surprising Insights into the Evolutionary Origins of Heart Disease and Why It Matters. Dr. Hussey guides clients from around the world back to health by using the latest research and health attaining strategies. In his downtime, he loves to be outdoors, play sports, read, write, and travel. Well, I have been watching Dr. Hussey on Instagram for a while now and loving all the incredible amount of valuable information that he puts out there on his platform. And I finally reached out and asked if he would be on. And so I'm thrilled to have a conversation here. Dr. Hussey is really an expert in the functioning of the heart and in research on heart disease, strokes, heart attacks, things of that sort. And he himself has had his own experience with that personally. So we get into his story behind how he came to studying, to this line of research and specialty care. We also get into the cholesterol conversation and why it is or isn't relevant to the reality of heart disease. We are going to talk about the jab and everything that happened with COVID and how that is playing out in the scientific research as far as its effects on the heart. So that's an interesting part of the conversation. And then we also start talking about autoimmunity, and he proposes a different way of understanding what autoimmunity actually means inside the body and how it's functioning. So I really want you to listen into this one. We definitely get very sciencey, but as far into the science talk that Dr. Stephen gets, he also brings it around and explains it really well. So it's very accessible for the common, the common person to understand. So before we dive in, I just want to ask you to take a minute to please like and subscribe to this podcast. It helps both my message and my guest message get out further for more people to listen to, for more people to learn from. And it really, really helps me grow my platform. So I thank you ahead of time for doing that. And now let's dive in to this episode with Dr. Stephen Hussey. Dr. Stephen Hussey, thank you so much for joining us today on the Health Bridge podcast. I know that you have really in-depth, valuable information for our listeners. So I'm really happy to introduce them to you. So thanks for being here.
Of course. Yeah. Happy to be here.
So you are both a chiropractor and functional medicine practitioner, and your kind of specialty is in heart health. I'm curious what your background is, what spun you into that direction? How did you start?
Yeah. Well, as a kid, I ended up with a lot of inflammatory conditions, I guess I'd call them. Everything from asthma to allergies to chronic hives and irritable bowel syndrome, all these different things that you could consider inflammatory conditions. And ultimately ended up with autoimmune type 1 diabetes. I was diagnosed at age 9. And, my parents and I were pretty dependent on Western medical system to help, manage these conditions, I guess. And so, that is what it is. And then it wasn't until probably college that I started figuring out that the way I live my life had a direct impact on my ability to manage these conditions, and got rid of most of them, aside from the type 1 diabetes, kind of collateral damage from that inflammation. But yeah, so, I thought that was interesting that, no doctor had ever told me, well, you can change these lifestyle things and these things will go away or they'll get better. And so, because I initially had a really good relationship with my pediatric endocrinologist. He's a great guy, but I kind of got disillusioned with the fact that I was never told these things by a medical doctor, because I was like, I thought, oh, I'm going to go be a physician of some sort because I had that good relationship with him. And I was like, well, do I want to do that? And I'm lucky that early on I kind of had those doubts, otherwise I could have done that and gotten into that system, but I didn't. I went, to be a chiropractor, and that opened my mind to a lot of different things. And so, because of my personal health history with being type 1 diabetic, I'm very predisposed to heart disease. So I was told, from all the doctors growing up. It was, little posters everywhere in the clinics, like, diabetics are more prone to vascular damage and all these different things. And so I've always kind of paid attention to that, and throughout my formal training and then all my independent research and everything. And so one day I looked up and I had all this information on the heart and heart disease that was a lot of it very contrary to what I learned in school and what the conventional wisdom is. And I started sharing it on social media, and people seemed to like it. And then eventually I wrote a book, and then, quite shocking to me, I guess it's been 3 years now. 3 years ago, I actually had a heart attack. And so that was, hit me, kind of blindsided me. And there are reasons for that, I think, that I talk about in a YouTube talk that I gave. Well, I gave it at Roanoke College, but it's on YouTube. It's called The Heart Attack Survival Story. If people want to check that out, it's on my YouTube channel. But yeah, so I've always been kind of interested in the heart. I'm interested in health in general, but the heart has kind of been a specific interest of mine.
I want to touch on there. The first is that you said it was kind of like this crazy light bulb when you realized that the way you lived your life actually affected your health. And why weren't you told that by your doctors? That's a lot of my story too. It's in a lot of my messaging to my listeners and to my clients. We can make subtle changes in our life and have positive outcomes from them, or the opposite. And for me, I've had a basically 20-year health journey at this point, starting with mono and, eventually long time later coming around to a lupus diagnosis. None of my doctors, except for one rheumatologist, ever discussed anything about lifestyle other than, oh, maybe you should stop eating dairy. Like literally that's the most helpful thing I got. And so I'm all about, with this podcast and with my messaging, is telling people how they can actually do all these subtle changes to affect the outcome of their health diagnosis. So I love that you're speaking to that. Tell us more about your heart attack story, just because you were so aware of that possibility, being that you had type 1 diabetes and you do so many lifestyle things to keep that from happening, right? And yet it still happened. Would you mind teasing that out a little bit more for us?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, I guess the moral for me is, like, to skip to the end first, is it can happen to anybody. And the reason that is, I think, is because our modern way of life is not completely, but in many ways incompatible with proper physiologic function. And that starts, conception all the way. So like there's a lot of things that were out of my control, and there's things that I may not even know contributed that happened. But there's also a lot of things that, because this whole, conversation about heart disease and heart attacks is very centered around, diet and cholesterol. Because of this cholesterol theory, there's cholesterol in foods. And so then the conversation about heart disease becomes about food. And that is one, I would say, small part of what causes heart disease. But in my earlier, I guess, investigations, like that's what I focused on more, because you realize that theory doesn't stack up. There's really no evidence behind it. And the history behind why it became a theory is shocking too. And so, that's what I had focused on a lot. And so I was very good at controlling diet because, that was important. That made a lot of positive changes for me, but it wasn't everything. And so, just focusing on that, like the reason that happened was is I'm very heavily predisposed as a type 1 diabetic. No matter what I do, my blood sugars are never going to be as regulated as someone who's a non-type 1 diabetic. And so that's a factor. But the other thing was that I was under a very extreme amount of stress at the time, more stress than I'd ever had in my life. And, some people may, listen to the stress that I had and say, oh, that's nothing compared to what I had. But, stress is it's relevant to the person and what they've experienced before. And so, I was going through a lot of stress, and then I got probably the most stressful news I've ever had in my life a day and a half before I had the heart attack. And it wasn't just that news happened. I got that news Sunday night. It was the inability of me or my family to do anything about it for this person that it was about that really contributed to this prolonged state of stress. I spent all day Monday trying to figure out how to mitigate the situation and couldn't figure anything out. I woke up Tuesday morning and had a heart attack after I did a very extreme workout, which I probably should not have done in that state of stress. I probably shouldn't have tried to do the normal workout that I do, which is very intense workout that I was doing at the time. And so, yeah, that's what kind of led up to it. But I also, there's many things that I've learned since then that I wasn't doing as far as what induces clotting, because that is what ultimately causes a heart attack. It's not some buildup of cholesterol. It's not even stenosis in a coronary artery. There's a lot of different things that can cause heart attacks, but it's at the end of the day, it's spontaneous clotting in an artery. And that's exactly what happened to me, because there was no atherosclerosis in my heart arteries at all. There was just a giant clot that formed. And so the things that will induce clotting are, I wasn't doing everything I could have at the time. There's a lot of things that I was aware of, but I wasn't necessarily doing. I'd always been good with diet and stuff like that. And then you add the stress on top of those things. But at that time, I wasn't paying attention to the light. I wasn't paying attention to, stress management or contact with the earth and different things like that. So there's a lot of different things that I've learned since, or that I kind of knew before, but I'm doing more of now, that probably would have prevented it. But yeah, the stress on top of it wasn't good. And lots of people say it was the COVID vaccine. So I've never been vaccinated and never will be. So it was not that. And that's a lot of people think when I tell this story, is that, oh, that's what it was. It's like, no, they weren't even out then when this happened. So it was definitely not that, though those can cause that. It wasn't that for me.
Well, I do want to get into that conversation in a few minutes, but first off, let's just start by, in case people are new to the cholesterol conversation, could you give kind of a quick synopsis of why the cholesterol narrative is false?
Yeah.
And how that came to be?
Yeah. Well, so first off, from a kind of a philosophical perspective, to blame an entire disease process on one molecule is incredibly reductionist and short-sighted. And it shows that there's, I think there's a fundamental flaw in the way most research is done, in that we're trying to isolate a single variable and say that it causes something or does something within a research study, when in reality, our bodies are never exposed to one thing at the same time. At one time, they're exposed to multiple different things all at the same time. Tons of biochemistry is happening within our bodies all the time. And so it's a really short-sighted view of disease in general. But if you look at the history of how it came about, it all started in, because heart disease in the early 1900s was like almost unheard of. There was no specialty of cardiology. There was very few quote unquote cardiologists. There was a few like fringe doctors that were interested in it, and they were like, looking into it and everything. But then in the 1940s, after World War II, heart disease started to rise, and everybody was wondering why this was. And Eisenhower famously had a heart attack while in Oval Office. And so everybody was kind of freaking out about this new upcoming disease. So first of all, let's pause right there and make the statement that how could a molecule that's been in our bodies for eternity, since humans have been around, cholesterol, and a food like animal foods that humans have been eating since the dawn of humans, and even before that, it's literally, you can make the argument that it is a food that made us modern humans what we are today. How could that be the cause of disease when this is a new disease? At least in the epidemic that we've seen it, there's evidence that, the ancient Egyptians had atherosclerosis and things like that. But it's a disease of civilization. And, for, hundreds of thousands of years as modern humans, and for millions of years for hominid species, meat was consumed and cholesterol was there. So there's that. So anyways, in the 1940s and 50s, people were freaking out. And some scientist named Ansel Keys decided to give them an answer. And his answer was to do what he called his 6-country study. And then eventually he did another one called a 7-country study. And what he did was he took the data available from these 6 and then 7 countries and showed that the amount of cholesterol on animal foods, like saturated fat that people were eating in a certain country, correlated with how much heart disease the country had. He showed an association between the two. Now, there's lots of issues with associational research, but the biggest issue was not something that was, a problem with associational research. It was a problem with his technique, in that there was data from 22 countries available at the time. And he chose the 6 countries and eventually the 7 countries that gave him the correlation that he wanted. So he cherry picked the data. And then there was some scientists later, I think in 1959, that repeated the study and used the data from all 22 countries and found no correlation whatsoever. But by that time, the ship had sailed, and the theory took off, and a lot of industry got behind it, for certain reasons. So the sugar and cereal and grain industry got behind it because it allowed them to push these foods that were low in cholesterol, which is what they sold. And they started, bashing the animal foods and cholesterol and things like that. Pharmaceutical companies liked it because then if you blame cholesterol on heart disease, then you could take these drugs that they had, statin drugs that lower cholesterol, and that drove their marketing. And so in 1984, this committee got together and they incorrectly decided that cholesterol was bad. And that committee was heavily influenced by pharmaceutical companies. And so they put together these committees to educate doctors on how to manage people's cholesterol. And so when we first decided cholesterol was bad, officially, they said that LDL should be lower than 250. And then eventually the pharmaceutical companies got that lowered down to 200 and then 150. And then now it's supposed to be lower than 100 or 100 or lower is what they say now, which means we have no idea what cholesterol is supposed to be. It's all these recommendations of what it's supposed to be have all been funded by pharmaceuticals. And yeah, we have no idea. But we do have research today that shows that, the associated levels, which is just associations, with the lowest all-cause mortality are higher than what the recommendations are today. So that's kind of the history of the theory. And so that's been, what it's been. That's the theory that's stuck. It's the conventional wisdom now, and it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. And there's plenty of research, newer research is coming out saying, oh, we got it wrong about saturated fat. Cholesterol is not something we should be pushing to lower. There's research that says that, but the standard of care is still the same if you go to your Western medical physician. So yeah. And then if you want, I can go into because people say, well, if it's not cholesterol, what is it? Why do we see cholesterol accumulating in the lining of the artery? So if you want me to go into that, I can.
I would that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in fact, there's a few studies that I found that if you analyze atherosclerosis in coronary arteries, heart arteries, very little of it is cholesterol. It's actually the vast majority of it, like 87 plus or minus 8%, is fibrotic clotting tissue. So it's the same type of thing that forms if you cut your skin and the scab forms to stop the bleeding. It's clotting tissue, which makes sense. If there's damage to the lining of an artery, your body's going to try and stop that artery from rupturing, which is going to deposit something that stops bleeding or stops the kind of quote unquote spackles or heals that up. And that is clotting tissue. Now, if clotting tissue forms over and over again, it can build up and create this stenosis or narrowing of an artery. And so the theory is that if that clotting tissue, that atherosclerotic, whatever, regardless what it's made of, if it ruptures, it breaks, then a clot will form or part of it will break off and it'll flow down to a smaller artery, and that will block the blood flow and cause a heart attack. And there's this fascinating paper called The Myth of the Vulnerable Plaque that was published in 2015. And in 2015, these investigators took all the available evidence on this ruptured plaque theory and analyzed it. And some of the lines from their their paper are fascinating. The fact that they titled it "The Myth of the Vulnerable Plaque" is telling. But it basically shows that when that plaques do rupture, but their in number was 0.06% of the time does that result in a heart attack. So what happens is a plaque ruptures and it just kind of forms and it gets bigger, and then another plaque ruptures and it gets bigger, and eventually it could stenose and block the whole artery. But that's not what causes heart attacks, because if that happens, because it happens gradually enough, the body has time to build collateral arteries around it. And there's really fascinating work by Dr. Giorgio Beraldi, who showed through doing autopsies and making these plastic casts of real hearts that every time there's a more than 60 or 70% narrowing of an artery, the body builds collaterals around it. And it does it very quickly. There's research that shows that it can form within 4 days, enough collaterals that fully compensate the heart with blood. So these ruptures are not, and these stenosis of an artery are not what's causing heart attacks. And the cherry on top of that is the research that shows that when we treat those stenoses, when we put a stent in there electively, or when we do a bypass surgery, those things don't prevent heart attacks. You could have it or you could not have it, and the likelihood you have a heart attack is exactly the same. And there is tons of research on that, multiple studies and review studies that show that these procedures don't work. Why? Because the stenosis is not what causes the heart attack. Clotting causes the heart attack. So what we should really be focusing on is how do we stop the blood from clotting spontaneously? And so those are the things, that's what's causing heart attacks. Now, I, at this point, think that, the process of atherosclerosis, which is hardening of the artery, and the process of a heart attack are two very different things. They don't have much to do with each other. The atherosclerosis can maybe affect blood flow a little bit, and that can, make it more likely that something might clot because, turbulent blood is more likely to clot. But that's the only way they're related, I think. They're two very different things and very different processes based on all this research and evidence. However, the reason that they're done is because it's very profitable. It's very profitable to do these stents and bypass surgeries, and it's very profitable to sell drugs like statins. And so the theory is very profitable and it makes people a lot of money. So they don't want to hear, or the system, not necessarily the people, but the system doesn't want to hear that it's not the cause, because then they can't make enough money or as much money.
I agree that it's the system and not necessarily the people that are performing these things. I think that they are just so convinced that that is the correct way to help people. But what does somebody do if they are in the doctor's office, they're having problems, the doctor says, you need a stent right away, or you need statins right away. You're heading right down the tunnel of, towards a heart attack or a stroke. How does somebody arm themselves with information? Or, is there a point where they really are at a point where they need something major to shift so that they can avoid that outcome? Like, what's your recommendations?
Yeah, and it's a really,
I know that's a big question.
Yeah, it's a really hard thing, because it really, and I can tell people about my experience in the hospital after a heart attack, because I was sitting there and being told those exact things. You need a statin for the rest of your life. You need 2 blood pressure medications. You need this blood thinner. You need, they prescribed 11 different medications while I was in the hospital. And they said that 5 of them, including a baby aspirin, I have to be on the rest of my life. And just so people know, I'm not taking anything right now, and I won't. And so in that situation, it's hard because I was equipped with knowledge. I knew what to ask them, and I knew what I could ask them. And I knew based on their answers if they were saying something that's not true based on the research. So that's the advantage that I have, because some would say unhealthily obsessed with health or something like that. And I just go into the research and I find the stuff. So if someone's sitting in the doctor's office, it's hard. But if someone says you need this stent, which is an elective stent, you could argue that emergency stents save lives. Like, I have a stent now. Did that save my life? I could debate that, but in lots of cases, yes. In that emergency situation, yes. But if you're in that situation and your doctor's telling you that, all you have to do, even if you don't know the research by heart or know how many studies are, you just ask them, Are you aware of any research that shows that stent procedures don't prevent heart attacks? And if they say no, then they're either lying or they're ignorant to the fact that there is a lot that says that. If they can't give you a response like that, then you need to choose another doctor. And if you want to find that research, you can look in my book or Dr. Asim Malhotra's book, who's a cardiologist in Britain, who's been saying this for a long time. The elephant in the room is that these procedures don't work. And so that's all you have to do is that simple question. And then you'll get your answer as to, are you getting an educated answer or not from this doctor, or a lie potentially, which you hope it's not a lie. I hope it's just they don't know. And so, and they're showing that they don't know when they give you your answer. And it's the same with anything. Statins. You need this statin drug. Okay. Are you aware of any evidence that shows the statin drugs are not effective and they don't help? And if they say no, then they're not up on the research because there is clearly evidence that they don't. Are you aware of any evidence that statins cause a lot of side effects that I may not want? No, they're fine. That doctor is lying or ignorant. And so you'll get a lot of answers if you just ask them that stuff. You don't have to know. Just ask them if they know. And if they give you the wrong answer, then you know what you need to do. You need to find another doctor or more information or something. So, yeah.
It's hard when you are sitting in on the patient's side of the table and you have that authority figure saying, you need this. I've studied this. You need this, or you're going to XYZ result.
Yeah. It's hard to have that confidence. Yeah.
I think too that people, if they can rely on somebody else doing something to them, for them, it takes it a little bit out of their hands, and it's like, I'm going to be saved. And it's almost a relief without them having to actually dive deeper and do much shifting internally or with, mentally, whatever their thought process is around their health and their self-care practices. It's hard to look at things that we maybe are doing to ourselves.
Yeah,
we've
created a society that outsources everything, right? So we have to be good at one thing, which is our job, whatever our job is, so that we can make money. And then we outsource everything else, which some things that's okay to outsource, because there's little harm with that. But there's a lot of things that aren't okay to outsource. And one of those is our health, because no one is ever going to care more about your health than you, including that doctor that you're paying to care about your health. They're just not. And that's just the reality of it. And the truth is that we can't afford to outsource that completely. We have to be knowledgeable, and that's just the reality of it. So unfortunately, people are going to have to take a more active role in becoming educated and learning about their health and then taking action to preserve it, because, the doctors or any healthcare provider, and I include myself in that, isn't going to care more about your health than you, and is not going to be an expert in you. And so you really have to take that initiative. And that's what people need to know. They need to realize that someone's not going to save you. You can't just wait until something goes wrong and someone's going to save you. And unfortunately, people do wait because they're told no differently. And they end up in the doctor's office and the doctor says, I can't save you. Or the answer you get is, you're like, what? I thought you could just fix this. And they're going to be very surprised that they just can't. Or they give you a treatment that's ineffective or causes other things. And so that's just the reality that people have. And until you have that experience, you don't start to doubt the system. And it's where we're at.
Doubting the system is definitely where I'm at. Definitely where I've been, something that became pretty obvious to me years ago when I, had mono, and they ended up just saying, well, we think you have chronic fatigue syndrome. It'll probably go away within 2 years. And essentially, like, good luck. I was like, okay, so I have to do this on my own. I'll figure something out,
Yeah. It's basically chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. Basically, we don't know.
Exactly. And even back then, before I really knew anything about health, I could interpret that to know that they didn't know what the heck they were talking about, because my blood work looked, relatively normal. There wasn't anything active going on. The mono wasn't active, Epstein-Barr virus. So yeah, I had to take it into my own hands. And So I do want to get into, some talks about nutrition, some autoimmune stuff. But first, let's talk about the last few years. You mentioned that you did not get the vaccine and won't, but you've been very active in the research on the effects, some of the outcomes that we're seeing now from the jab. So can you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, again, from the get-go, fundamentally, it makes no sense that this is going to save anything or anyone. First of all, they've been trying to make a mRNA vaccine since the 80s, and they haven't been successful. And then all of a sudden, this big quote unquote need for it or big opportunity to sell it comes about, and within a year they have one. That's suspicious to me. But secondly, health doesn't come in an injection. It doesn't come in a pill or any type of external something that's going to try and affect your biochemistry. So yeah, so the way that any injection works, especially, this is not necessarily a vaccine, because the vaccine actually has an attenuated piece of virus, which you could argue viruses don't even exist, but that's technically a vaccine. Whereas this is an mRNA technology. So let me just explain that to people. It means that there's a strand of mRNA that they're using in place of the virus to try and inoculate you, to get your body used to fighting off something that it hasn't even been exposed to yet, so that when you are exposed, it can help you fight it off. The issue is that, and this could go into a lot of rabbit holes, but the issue is that they've never actually isolated and purified what they're calling COVID-19, which means they've never really found it, which means they don't have an entire strand of DNA, which is why they have to use a strip of mRNA that they think correlates to a strip of the COVID-19 DNA sequence. So it's all just a guess, a big guess. And if you injected an attenuated virus, if viruses exist, or you injected a strip of mRNA into your body would be like, just brush it off, right? It wouldn't do anything. So if I want my body to have some sort of immune response to that thing so that I develop quote unquote immunity, you have to piss the immune system off. And to do that, you have to inject toxins, because the immune system is not something that fights off pathogens. It's something that detoxifies your body. And so the reason that I know that is that viruses have never really been proven to cause illness, and that goes back a long time. But B is that when you inject somebody with a quote unquote, what you think is a virus or an attenuated virus or a strand of mRNA from a virus, it has no reaction. But it does have a reaction if you inject a bunch of toxins with that thing, which means to activate our immune system, you need to be toxic. That's what our immune system is doing, is there's toxins and there's very low charge of the body, which means like our body is supposed to have this net negative charge. The pH is 7.4. It's a net negative, whereas you're more acidic, you're more hydrogen ions, more positive. So we're supposed to have this net negative charge. And when you inject toxins, it messes with our ability to maintain charge. And your body goes through this big detoxification reaction to get rid of things. That's what the cold and flu every year is. It's not cold and flu season, it's detox season. And if we keep trying to do the same things we do in the summer that we do in the winter, we can't detox, and then we have these detox responses. And, an injection like that is just injecting toxins into your body, and it makes your body have this detox response. And so we get all these adverse reactions and things, and because you're decreasing the charge of your body, and your body's got to get rid of those injected toxins. And that's pretty much it. There's no real therapeutic benefit. It doesn't create immunity. And we've seen that. There's plenty of research now that shows that it does not prevent someone from getting COVID or spreading COVID if you, in fact, spread it. It's something that you spread. It doesn't have any of those effects. In those early studies from whoever it was, I think it was Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, they, 95% effective. Effective at what? They didn't even really specify that. And they used relative risk instead of absolute risk, which is a statistic Indiana Jones switch kind of thing that they use to make it seem more effective than it was. When in reality, if you did absolute risk, I think it was like 0.08 was the number, I think it was. So yeah, all that stuff was altered. And so then we get all these people that had these injected toxins, and there's, you can look at the package inserts, and there's, graphene oxide and polyethylene glycol and those things, which are, very toxic to us. And so these things can be hard for our body to get rid of. And they, like I said, they interfere with our body to maintain its net negative charge. And that creates inflammation. Inflammation is a more positive charge situation, any inflammation. And these things really affect that. They affect the mitochondria's ability to maintain our net negative charge. Is that leaves the body in this state of slightly positive charge, this inflamed state. And we tend to get, one thing that happens is we get clotting, which is what we've seen. We've seen blood clotting like in the lungs and in the leg and things like that. We've seen myocarditis and pericarditis, which it tends what was in these things tended to target the heart tissue for whatever reason. And when you get a state of inflammation, friction is not a friend. Just like if I have an overuse injury, like a tennis elbow or golfer's elbow or something like that, you get some inflammation, overuse and friction of that is not going to help. And so the organ that is constantly moving gets inflamed because it's creating friction. It's moving. Just like if we move our arm over and over again, it gets inflamed. So the heart tends to suffer. And I just listened to a video of a testimony in some government hearing by Dr. Robert Malone, who is one of the inventors of mRNA technology. He has patents on these things, and he's speaking out against them. And he says that based on his calculations, somewhere between 750 to 1,000 articles showing that these things cause harm in various forms, whether it's clotting, whether it's myocarditis, pericarditis, whatever it is. There's a lot of evidence now that these things cause harm. And there's a lot of evidence that the potential harm was known and they were still pushed forward. So that's what I can say about that.
Robert Malone was drug through the mud, especially I think after Joe Rogan interview. Mm-hmm. And I've been realizing over the last few years, anyone who gets that kind of treatment that quickly and that drastically might be somebody I should pay attention to.
Yeah. Well, and it's crazy too, like the things that like his reputation and his career is pretty phenomenal. He's a smart guy and he's done a lot of good things. Same with Peter McCullough. He's like one of the most cited cardiologists in history, had a very reputable career. And so instead of listening to these people that had these careers and chose to go against the narrative, we just write them off, or they tend to be written off. And it's just like, and I remember, I had some, unfortunate, like with people that I care about, like family members and friends and things that I kind of present information to, and they show me like, things that like, oh, Twitter and Instagram censored them. So, that they're not right. And it's like, I just gave you information from these very well-established like researchers and like people from, very prestigious institutions. And you're telling me that Twitter, and is back before Elon Musk had Twitter and Instagram and Facebook are smarter than them. And they say, nope, now they're wrong. We're going to censor them. Like there's no logic behind that whatsoever. It's some kind of emotional, I don't know, something.
It's an emotional need. I think it's an emotional need for things to be simple and straightforward. And so we find ways of just believing the things that make it simple and straightforward so that we don't have to be confused and scared. We want to believe the vast majority and go along with the vast majority because it's easier,
Yeah. I've even theorized too that it's like COVID was hard for people because of, not necessarily because of the disease. I mean, that was hard for some people, but for most people, COVID was hard because of the life changes we had to make that were being forced upon us. And I kind of had this theory that people were so resistant to the truth when it was starting to come out and this information because they wanted to think that the changes they had to make that were hard were worth it. They did it for a reason. And then we're getting this information that shows them that what you did wasn't even needed or worth it, and all that struggle was for nothing. And they don't want to accept that. They want to be like, oh no, that was for something. And so it's hard to come to grips with that for a lot of people. That's just one theory I had.
Yeah. So let's do a quick rundown of nutrition. And I know that nutrition isn't the only thing that affects the heart health, but let's talk about it for a minute because there is still a lot to discuss there. And
Mhm.
then I also want to talk about just the other changes that you said you were aware of, but
Mhm.
you weren't really implementing prior to going through your health experience.
Mhm.
I want to make sure that our listeners take away some, really actionable tips that they
Yeah.
can start to look into and apply to their own lives.
So my diet talk has gotten much simpler over the years. It used to be more complicated, and I used to talk a lot more about diet, but everybody wants to talk about diet as far as like your macros, like your energy, your fats, carbs, proteins, and what ratio you should eat in fasting and all these things. And I think that yes, energy from food is important. It's one way that we gain energy, but it is not the only way that we can get energy from our environment. And there are some scientists that say that it is only about a third of how we get energy. And so energy from food is, to me, not the important factor. What we need are nutrients. That's what we should focus on when we're getting food: protein, vitamins, and minerals. Those are what we need. And so if you look at the most bang for your buck, proteins, vitamins, and minerals, it's animal foods, hands down. As far as the most nutrient dense, the most high quality protein, and the most bioavailable to our digestive systems, and what humans are more adept at eating based on our dietary past, animal foods are it. And then we should eat plant foods if you want to. You don't have to. But there could be some benefits, but in season, definitely. So you should not be eating blueberries in right now, December, unless you live in a tropical area where blueberries and tropical fruits are there all the time. There's a lot to be said for eat the foods that grow local and in season only. So in the summer, I'll have some summer squash if I can find it at the farmer's market. But right now, 100% animal foods, because this is all that I could really find in my environment if I was out there hunting, right? Gathering. Everything else would be dead. And even if I farmed, and I preserved some things, those things were grown locally. So maybe I'd eat those through the winter. But animal foods, hands down, are the most bang for your buck. And plant foods, could potentially have a lot of issues. And a lot of people talk about the plant toxins, which can cause a lot of issues in people. I don't, dispute that. But I think that more problematic is the light information stored in your food. And if you're eating a food that was grown halfway across the world and it has a different light information, when you digest that food in your gut and that light information is released into our body, and the light information you're getting from outside is your local environment, and that's a different environment, it becomes very confusing. And there's even some literature that shows that confusing light information is triggering autoimmunity, because the gut is where the immune system is getting confused. That light's reflecting onto the gut, and that's creating some issues. So that's very interesting. So lots of people who go carnivore and say, oh, my autoimmune stuff improved. Yeah, but was it the plant toxins? Maybe a little bit. Was it the light environment too? You eliminated all the different light environments by eliminating plants. Maybe if you ate foods in season, you'd be okay still. Maybe not. Depends on a lot of different things and everything that's happened to you in your life. But that's kind of my spiel on diet. Focus on proteins, vitamins, and minerals, which animal foods are your best bet. And if you are going to eat plants, eat them in season pretty strictly, because that is huge. The light environment is very huge. And that's what eating in season, local and in season, does for us. Yeah. And then what was the second part of your question?
I don't remember, but I'll figure it out in a second. just to just to clarify, when you're talking about the light codes, because I think that's language that some people might not
Mm,
understand. What you're saying is when you're eating locally and seasonally, the light codes come from the sun being at different parts of the sky at different times of year.
mm,
And that type of light, based on what time of year it is, informs the food. It seeds the food with information. And then when you take in that information, it's telling your body, yes, I am where I'm supposed to be, when I'm supposed to be, basically. And so when you are, say, up in Michigan and you're eating lettuce or strawberries that were grown in Mexico in the middle of winter, you're totally confusing your body because it's getting light codes from Mexico, which is an entirely different climate. And you're ingesting that when your body's like, I'm supposed to be practically hibernating right now. So that
Exactly.
is what's causing that confusion and essentially like dysbiosis in the gut, which could be triggering to autoimmunity.
Well, it's really confusing the actual cells in the line, the epithelial cells in the lining of the gut, because the bacteria, they don't have DHA, so they can't absorb that light information. So the only cells there, the only living things there in the gut that can absorb the information is the lining of our gut, because we use DHA, and DHAs would allow us to take light information. And so, you think about it, like everybody says, these autoimmune issues, like the gut is so important, heal the gut, all this stuff. But what also we know about autoimmune stuff is that it's confusion. What is the body doing? Quote unquote, attacking another part of the body that it shouldn't be. Right. So there's all kinds of things that we do within our modern lifestyles that create confusion. And confusion is all about communicating to your body what season it is, where it is on the earth, all these different things. And so that means light, that means the grounding electromagnetic fields, all those different things are creating a lot of confusion. And when that happens, the body starts to see itself or certain parts of itself as foreign because it's confused. It's lost communication. It's like you have somebody right next to you, but you can't talk to them. You don't even know they're there because you've lost communication with them. And if you feel like you're on your own, this cell starts reacting like it's on its own and not communicating with its peers and doing what's best for the system as a whole. So like autoimmunity, cancer, all these different things are when we're creating confusion in the body. So much confusion that it's like cells don't know what to do. They don't know how to operate because they're for millions of years, billions of years, if we can consider all life and the mechanisms in all life that are there, they're looking for signals from the environment. And that signal could be food, and where you ate it or where it came from, which evolutionarily it would have only been something literally within 5 miles of you each day or something like that. The right light environment, where you are on the earth, the right electromagnetic field, it being contacted with the earth. And then we have all these artificial ones around that are just confusing our bodies. All of these things are confusing our bodies. And then we have this kind of unnatural amount of stress that makes us think that we're always in a stress response, which is also very confusing to the body. It never gets into this full relaxed state where there's more balance because it's never really one or the other. All these confusing signals, food being one of them, is to me what's triggering autoimmunity. And then the body gets confused and attacks something that it shouldn't.
That is probably the best explanation that I've ever heard. Like that makes so much logical sense to me. And I've never heard it explained like that before. So how else, because I have a lot of autoimmune community people that listen to this show, how else can they start creating that communication pipeline, essentially, I guess, in the body through the gut, I'd love to dive into the exclusion zone water in the body, through the light codes. How can we start incorporating these things into our daily life to start creating that, sense of community within the body again?
Yeah. Yeah. It's all about what signals you're sending your body. And so I'll kind of start this because I can start talking about this and it could sound really overwhelming, right? Like all these things I got to pay attention to. And like, how do I learn enough about it to know what I should do and what I shouldn't do and all this stuff? It can sound overwhelming, and all you can do is one thing at a time. But a good way to frame it is ask yourself what's real. Okay. So if I was just a human, I was plopped in the middle of the woods somewhere, and I'm surrounded by, it's harder and harder to find these things, but I'm surrounded by real things. Right? I'm surrounded by real light, the only light that's ever been around until Edison invented modern light or indoor light. There's only real food around me. I may not know how to get it, but it's there. It's real food. And this time of year, it would pretty much only be animals if I was lucky enough to or skillful enough to get them. I would have real contact with the earth. I would have the only electromagnetic field that's ever been in contact with humans or life in general is either electromagnetic fields from other life or from the earth itself. I'd have real air that wasn't full of all these, you know, pollutants and things like that. And everything would be real. And that's the context of what. So then you kind of say, okay, well, now I have this modern life that I have to do all these things. I can't go live in the woods. I probably wouldn't survive in the woods these days because we don't have the skills to. So how do I create more reality, what my body knows is real, not what's real to me in my mind and what I've learned in life. It's what's real for my body because that evolution has been there for a long time. And you start learning how to do that within the context of your modern world. So you mitigate electromagnetic fields if you can. Turn off your Wi-Fi at night. Simplest thing you can do. You don't need it. Turn it off. Keep your phone away from you when you're not using it, and don't ever put it up to your ear. Always use speaker and all these different things you can use to reduce your exposure. You're never going to get rid of all of them, but try and reduce the exposure. You can hire a building biologist that can come in and analyze your home and help you mitigate and how to reduce exposure, things like that. Or, people notice I'm wearing these glasses and I'm sitting here in relatively low. These are incandescent bulbs with very low blue light. They still have a little bit, but it's very low. And because right now there is no blue light, there's really no light present outside. There's a little bit like from the moon and stars and things, but it's not enough to trigger, my body that there's light, because blue light is what tells your body what time it is. And so in the morning at sunrise, blue light spikes, and that tells your body the sun's up. And then it gets higher, and it's highest at solar noon, and then it gets lower and lower until it goes away when the sun sets. And so does red and infrared and everything. And so it's very important to let your body know, or get as close as you can to letting your body know when day and night is, because otherwise it gets very confused. And that not only confuses our body into things like autoimmunity, but it also prevents good sleep. It prevents detoxification. It literally messes with your cortisol, melatonin levels, all kinds of things. Very, very important, right? And then I mentioned like eating food in season. That's real. That's the most real thing you can do, because that's the way it would be if you were in the middle of the woods. So you have to keep going back to that question, like, should I use this shampoo? Let's look what's in it. Is this real? No, that's most of the time it's not. And so get as close to real as you can, as least toxic as possible, more natural ingredients, things like that. Like all that stuff is just going to make a huge impact, because you're framing what you're going to signal to your body in a way that it tells you what your body is used to for literally, you could say, billions of years, because lots of the evolved mechanisms in beings that were existed way before us are still present in us today. So that's kind of what it is. And you can go into the weeds talking about all kinds of stuff. But that is, and then I guess what I want to touch on is real positive, loving relationships. That is very, very key. And people don't realize it, that we are, more connected and have more friends than ever before. But we probably have less real, loving, positive relationships and positive, grateful outlooks of the world and the people in it. Like that is really important. And it's actually one of the main ways that it creates coherence in your body. Coherence is when everything's synced up and communicating and doing what's best for the system as a whole. And that's what the researchers at HeartMath have found, is that expressing love and gratitude and having those positive social relationships is probably the most coherence creating thing there is. So our minds are powerful. And so it's like those things should be real as well. Those real relationships, rather than these superficial ones or ones that are not serving you, which is hard because sometimes those relationships are people that you really care about. And so you have to learn how to mitigate those and create more reality in them, or at least come to terms with how you have that person in your life and set boundaries and things like that.
Thank you for bringing that up. Because that is also something that is not talked about enough, I think. And we're so stuck in this constant fight or flight, and our nervous system is so dysregulated. Just that one thing can make all the difference.
Look what happened to me.
To help bring us. Yeah. Yeah. I remembered the one thing that I asked you earlier. which will probably spin us into, over our time limit. Are you still okay on time?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Water in the body.
Mm.
Can you talk about the fourth phase of water and why that is so important to not just heart health, but just overall physical and mental health?
Yeah. So yeah, that's fascinating. And it ties right into what I just said. But yeah, so life evolved in the ocean. That was the first time. And just so people, it's just a fun fact. Life evolved in the depths of the ocean, and the only light that could penetrate that far was blue light, which is why, for the longest time, at least in the beginning, life only knew day and night through blue light, which is why blue light is what tells us what it's day or night today. That mechanism is still within us. Anyways, and so then life got more and more complex, and eventually could move around the ocean, and then eventually out of the ocean. And when life evolved to move out of the ocean, it didn't really leave the ocean; it just took it with it, because we are all water. We are all made up of water, and it's very salty water. If you look at our cells, it's just a bunch of ionic minerals in water. And the way that we were able to take that water with us is because we structured it, or we allowed it. Like, water has this unique ability to structure itself, which means become more like a gel. It's called this fourth phase water, this state of water that is in its fourth phase, not solid liquid gas, but it's more like a gel. You think like Jello, that or like the consistency of an egg yolk, or an egg white. I mean, like a raw egg white, that kind of gel-like consistency. And so most of the water in our body is in this state. And that's, if you doubt that, just take the tissue of your forearm and just move it around and be like, yep, that's Jello, right? That feels like a gel. Okay. So all of our cells are in the water in our cells should be in this structured state. But there's some water in our bodies that is liquid, and that's like there's some water in the blood and the lymphatic fluid and the cerebral spinal fluid. It's still somewhat liquid, but it still has the ability to structure itself. And water, having enough structured water in your body, it's one thing that allows us to maintain that net negative charge, as I talked about. Interfering with that, which means interfering with mitochondrial function or injecting a bunch of toxins that interfere with the formation of structured water, like a COVID injection, will mess with that negative charge, because the way the structured water forms, it holds this net negative charge. So if most of the water in your body is in this structured state, then you maintain this net negative charge. But also soaking up electrons from your environment is a way that you, or from food and things like that, that's what our physiology is meant to do, to maintain that charge, all held in water. And so water can also structure itself on the lining of these blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. And that actually does, the way that it structures itself, it creates a charge separation of the negative structured water and the positive proton ions that are separated from it. And that charge separation does the work of doing of like a battery. It does the energy, creates energy so that the fluid can move, because a positive and a negative next to each other is a battery. We know that when we put batteries in things, we put the positive and negative charge where they need to go. So this water is maintaining our net negative charge. It's like a little battery for us, creating energy. The research has shown that water can interact with the environment and like can absorb. It's like a liquid crystal. It can absorb light. It can absorb sound. It's like our antenna that allows us to interact with our environment. And what's fascinating is, the work of Marasu Emoto shows us that water actually responds to emotion. And he's shown this, that if you express gratitude or love or whatever to water and then you freeze it, the water forms these perfect crystalline ice structures, like snowflakes, look like a snowflake, But if you express negative emotion to it, anger and resentment and hate and things like that, then it's fragmented when you freeze it. It doesn't freeze very well. It doesn't structure itself very well. And so if you think about how we're made up of water, and I go back to those positive, loving relationships, the reason that they're so important is because they create they imprint this emotion onto the water that allows it to maintain its structure itself, which maintains our positive charge or a negative charge, which is all creating this coherence, and all of these things are created by the proper signals from your environment, right? And it's all just telling water what to do in our body. Cause we're like, you hear estimates, 80, 90% water. You break down the tissues of the heart and it's like 95% water, something like that. Like we're all mostly water. And then we have these proteins in there too. They give us the structure. So it's absolutely fascinating. And water it almost holds this intelligence. And it's very important to pay attention to. But it makes sense because we came from water. Life came from the water. And we've just packaged it up in ourselves and taken it with us.
And so to build up the easy
Mm,
water in our body, what sorts of things will build it up? What sorts of things will kind of break it down and make it less effective?
yeah. Anything that will bring electrons into your body will help build it up. And so that could be grounding. That could be any type of light, like any wavelength of light from the sun. All of them, including blue light, will help structure water. Infrared is the most absorbent water, the most structuring of water. Blue light is not bad. It's just at the wrong times, it's bad. And processed blue light, where it's just blue light or mainly blue light, that's bad. What else? Like infrared sauna, like that's a useful tool because it's infrared light. It's kind of this modern thing we can use that's not really real because it's not out in the woods, but it's this thing we can use in a modern world to kind of help us get more of what's real, which is the infrared cold exposure. So people don't realize, everybody says, oh, mitochondria, which are the little organelles in our cells that make energy, ATP, but that's not why they're there really. I mean, that's one thing that they do, but they also generate heat and they generate, a free radical and they generate water. They generate the perfect water that is structured and energized so that it can structure itself onto proteins in the cell. And so mitochondrial function is very important. So things like heat and cold exposure and things like that. And then things that will break down structured water being removed from that real natural environment, but also certain toxins like glyphosate has been shown to break it down. Magnetic fields have been shown to break it down or prevent it from structuring itself very well. I think the number from Dr. Pollock's lab is like 10 to 15% reduction in structured water formation with electromagnetic fields. I think he just used a Wi-Fi router. Those types of things. Yeah, I mean, all that kind of stuff.
Essentially, anything that removes us from being somehow connected with the earth and its natural cycles, right?
Yeah.
So even if we're in an indoor work environment all day, we don't get outside to see the sun or, whatever weather. We don't, maybe we work the swing shift. So
Mm,
we're up super late. We don't have our natural circadian rhythms. And, like you said, being around all the Wi-Fi's, all those things can affect the building of that structural water in our bodies.
yeah. And like in that kind of stuff with the light, like if you're getting exposed to this blue light at the wrong times, you're suppressing melatonin production. And melatonin is what not only tells you to go to sleep and fall asleep, but it also is what drives the autophagy and mitophagy that happens while you sleep. And that's super important because if a cell gets old or mitochondria gets old, and we just keep trying to run on those old cells and mitochondria, then we're going to get fatigue, we're going to get poor water formation, that kind of stuff. Whereas if the light is what's suppressing all that from happening. So if we block the blue light, we make melatonin, especially in the winter when it's dark longer, and we trigger all those things to happen, then we get this detoxification and autophagy and mitophagy that tell us to kill off those old ones and build new ones. And those new ones are really good at making structured water, right? And so that's like poor sleep or chronic poor sleep is something that can wreak havoc on our ability for our cells to be healthy, mitochondria and structured water.
I think we threw a lot at our listeners. So I'm not going to keep going, even though I feel like I could just continue to rabbit hole with you for hours.
Yeah, that's fun.
Where can our listeners find you? Where can they get your book?
Yeah. My website is resourceyourhealth.com. And it's really just a route to like my online health consulting, but I have a blog on there and some product recommendations and things like that. And then I'm on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. It's just at Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey. My book it's on Amazon, and it's also people who don't want to use Amazon, they can do the publisher's website, Chelsea Green Publishing, or it's on like other book selling websites. I think it's on Books A Million and Barnes and Noble and things like that. They can get it there if they wanted to, but yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all of that incredible information. I do hope to have you on again in the future so we can continue this conversation. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I am so kind of blown away by the way Dr. Stephen explained what autoimmunity is and interpreted how autoimmunity happens through, dysregulation in the body. That was just a new explanation to me. And as soon as he said it, I just felt just this innate knowing or understanding in my body that, yeah, that sounds like it. Like, I think that that is it. It really brought a light bulb moment for me in how to address and approach the autoimmune issue for myself and for my clients. So I'm super grateful for that. I also love how he said, just bring everything back to what is real. What is real? Just start thinking about that when you're going through your day and your daily habits, and just have that in the back of your head when you're driving to work, when you're at work, when you're interacting with family, when you're choosing what to eat at the grocery store or at a restaurant, or what recipe to make at home. Is it real? Is this something that, you know, my body will respond well to? Is this not real? Is this not something that is going to promote health for me and well being for me in my body? So, as we wrap up this year, 2023, we're almost at Christmas, actually. We're within a week of Christmas when this podcast comes out. And I just want you to have that thought process going as you approach 2024 and as you reflect on this year and your years past and where you're at with your health journey, and think about how you want to move forward. Think about everything that Dr. Hussey brought to light with the way we live and the simple changes that we can make, one at a time to shift things for us and make that. I always talk about making that 1 degree difference, that 1 degree shift every day. Just taking 1 degree of a different step over time lands you in a completely different place. And we can do that with our health. We can up-level our health that way without it being overwhelming, and by getting back to what's real. So I really want to encourage you and invite you to apply for a call with me. They are free. It's a great time for us to get to know each other and connect, but also to really dive into your particular health situation, see where you're at and where you want to get to. And in my coaching program, I go over so many of the things that we talked about today. We talk about the water in our body and the water we drink. We talk about getting outside, upregulating your circadian rhythm, grounding, all those simple things, getting the light codes through your food by eating locally and seasonally. I go over all of that with you, and I help you put it into a simplified, understandable, easy to take on new way of going about your self-care practice. So I really want to encourage you to consider the idea that you can make these changes despite everything else that's already going on in your life. And guess what? It's going to make everything else that's going on in your life easier when you are healthier and when you take time for self-care. So reach out to me, give yourself that gift of this free conversation, because you never know if this conversation could be the thing that changes the trajectory of your life and of your health. Let's get you on the path to getting to where you want to be. I look forward to talking with you, and I look forward to seeing you on our next episode of the Health Bridge podcast.